Have you ever prayed for help and felt like heaven stayed silent? Ethan Walker sat alone in his dark kitchen, staring at bills he couldn't pay and a future he couldn't see. The harder he tried, the more life seemed to push him down. Then a forgotten Bible verse came to mind, one he hadn't thought about in years. For a moment, hope flickered. But when things got even worse, Ethan faced a question that shook his faith. Was God still with him? What he discovered through an ancient biblical story didn't remove the storm overnight, but it changed the way he walked through it. And that changed everything. But the most surprising part of Ethan's journey was still ahead. Have you ever smiled in front of other people while quietly falling apart inside? Not because you wanted to hide the truth, but because you were tired of explaining a pain no one seemed to understand. If that feeling sounds familiar, then this story may feel less like a story and more like a reflection in a mirror. Ethan Walker knew that feeling well. Every morning, he woke up carrying a weight that had no visible shape. From the outside, his life looked ordinary. But deep inside, something was slowly breaking. The hardest battles are often the ones nobody can see. Have you ever noticed how a person can look completely fine while fighting a storm in their heart? Ethan sat alone in his kitchen before sunrise, surrounded by silence. The coffee grew cold in his hands as worries filled his mind. Bills, regrets, unanswered questions. The future felt uncertain, and the past felt heavy. Day after day, he kept moving forward because that is what people do. They keep going even when their hearts are exhausted. But how long can someone carry burdens without rest? How long can a soul wander without hope? What troubled Ethan most was not the struggle itself. It was the feeling that his struggle had no meaning. He began to wonder if anyone truly saw his pain. Maybe you have asked the same question in your own quiet moments. Yet there is a truth many of us forget when life becomes overwhelming. A wounded heart does not mean a forgotten heart. Sometimes the darkest seasons reveal needs we never noticed when life was comfortable. Ethan did not know it yet, but this painful chapter was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he believed about suffering, faith, and hope. Ethan carried on as if nothing was wrong. He answered messages, paid what bills he could, and smiled when people asked how he was doing. But each day felt heavier than the one before. What exhausted him most was not the work, the responsibilities, or even the uncertainty. It was the constant battle inside his own mind. Every setback seemed to whisper the same cruel message: you are not enough. You should be stronger. You should have figured this out by now. Have you ever noticed how suffering often becomes even more painful when it starts speaking in your own voice? Ethan was not only fighting his circumstances, he was fighting the stories he had begun to believe about himself. At night, when the world grew quiet, his thoughts grew loud. He replayed old mistakes. He questioned decisions he could no longer change. He compared himself to people who seemed happier, stronger, and more successful. The comparison stole what little peace he had left. Yet one of life's hidden truths is that comparison rarely reveals reality. It only magnifies our wounds while hiding the struggles of others. Deep down, Ethan longed for something simple. He wanted to believe that his life still mattered. He wanted to know that his value was not measured by his failures, his income, or the expectations he could not meet. That longing lives in many hearts. Every human soul needs more than success. It needs meaning. It needs connection. It needs hope. The beautiful thing about being human is that even when we are hurting, a small part of us continues searching for light. Ethan could not see a way forward yet. He could not imagine how things would change. But beneath the fear, beneath the disappointment, a quiet question remained alive within him. What if this struggle was not trying to destroy him, but teach him something he had never learned before? The next morning felt no different from the ones before. The same worries waited for Ethan. The same unanswered questions lingered in the corners of his mind. Yet something small happened that day, something so ordinary that another person might have missed it completely. While searching through an old drawer for a document, Ethan found a worn Bible covered in dust. He stared at it for a moment, surprised by the emotions it awakened. It reminded him of a time when faith felt simple, when hope came more naturally, before disappointment had hardened parts of his heart. Have you ever held something from your past and suddenly remembered a version of yourself you thought was gone forever? Ethan slowly opened the Bible. He was not looking for answers. In truth, he was not even sure he believed answers existed anymore. But his eyes landed on a passage he had once underlined years ago. The words spoke of strength for the weary and comfort for the burdened. He read them once, then again. The problems in his life did not disappear. The bills remained. The uncertainty remained. The pain remained. Yet for the first time in a long while, something else was present too, a tiny spark of possibility. One of life's quiet mysteries is that hope rarely arrives as a dramatic miracle. More often, it enters gently, like a small light beneath a closed door. Ethan could not explain why those words affected him. He only knew that for a brief moment, the crushing weight on his chest felt slightly lighter. Perhaps healing does not begin when all the answers appear. Perhaps it begins when a hurting heart becomes willing to believe that answers might exist. As Ethan closed the Bible, he found himself wondering whether this unexpected moment was merely a coincidence or the beginning of something he had not anticipated. For a few days, Ethan carried that small spark of hope with him. He returned to the old Bible more than once, reading a few verses whenever the noise inside his mind became too loud. But something unexpected happened. The more he wanted to believe, the more aware he became of his doubts. Questions he had ignored for years suddenly demanded answers. If God cared, why had so much pain entered his life? If faith mattered, why did he still feel so afraid? Sometimes the hardest part of healing is not facing our wounds. It is facing the questions hidden beneath them. Ethan began to realize that hope and doubt often live side by side in the same heart. One part of him wanted to trust again. Another part feared being disappointed again. He remembered prayers that seemed unanswered and dreams that had quietly fallen apart. The possibility of hope felt comforting, but it also felt dangerous. After all, if you expect nothing, you cannot be hurt by disappointment. Yet this is one of life's strange paradoxes. The walls we build to protect ourselves from pain often keep out healing as well. Late one evening, Ethan sat alone, staring out the window as darkness settled over the neighborhood. He found himself wondering whether his struggle had changed him more than he realized. Not just his circumstances, but his heart. When did caution become fear? When did self-protection become isolation? These questions lingered in the silence. Deep down, Ethan was beginning to understand something many people discover only after hardship. Suffering does not simply test what we believe about God. It also reveals what we believe about ourselves. And what Ethan saw was unsettling. Beneath the exhaustion was a growing fear that he was somehow forgotten, unseen, and left behind. Yet even as that fear tightened its grip, a quieter thought refused to disappear. What if the battle inside him was leading to a truth he could not yet see? There came a night when Ethan could no longer distract himself from the ache inside. The questions he had been carrying for weeks now felt heavier than ever. He sat alone in the darkness, not searching for answers anymore, but simply trying to understand why his heart felt so tired. The small spark of hope he had found seemed distant now, hidden behind layers of fear, disappointment, and uncertainty. Have you ever reached a point where you were no longer asking when things would get better, but whether they ever would? It is a lonely place, and yet more people know that feeling than they realize. Ethan looked back over the years and saw moments where he had tried his best, given his effort, cared deeply, and still ended up hurt. He wondered if all his striving had been leading nowhere. He wondered if he had misunderstood life itself. One of the most painful experiences a person can face is not failure. It is losing sight of meaning. When purpose becomes unclear, even ordinary days can feel unbearably heavy. As the silence filled the room, Ethan wrestled with thoughts he was almost afraid to admit. Was he forgotten? Had life simply moved on without him? Had he placed his hope in things that were never meant to carry the weight of his soul? These questions pierced deeply because they touched something universal within the human heart. We all want to believe that our struggles matter, that our pain is seen, and that our story is going somewhere beyond what we can currently understand. Yet even in this darkest moment, something quiet remained alive within Ethan. It was not confidence. It was not certainty. It was not even peace. It was simply the faintest willingness to keep searching. And sometimes that small willingness is more powerful than we know. A tiny flame may seem insignificant in a vast darkness, but it still proves that darkness has not won. Ethan could not see the path ahead, but somewhere beyond his questions, a deeper truth was waiting to be discovered. In the days that followed, Ethan stopped trying so hard to force answers. He was exhausted from carrying questions that seemed too heavy to solve. Instead, he began sitting quietly with them. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable, but little by little, he noticed something surprising. The pain he had been fighting so fiercely was revealing parts of himself he had never truly seen before. For years, he had believed that strength meant having everything under control. Yet now, when control had slipped through his fingers, he discovered how fragile that belief really was. Could it be that some lessons only become visible when our plans fall apart? One evening, while reflecting on his life, Ethan remembered stories from Scripture about ordinary people who faced uncertainty, loss, and waiting. What struck him was not how quickly their situations changed, but how deeply they themselves changed along the way. Their greatest transformations often happen long before their circumstances improved. That realization settled gently into his heart. Perhaps growth was not hiding on the other side of the struggle. Perhaps it was happening within the struggle itself. This was a difficult thought to accept. Like most people, Ethan wanted relief before wisdom, answers before patience, certainty before trust. Yet life rarely unfolds in that order. Sometimes the very season we wish to escape is quietly shaping the person we are becoming. There was another truth emerging as well. Ethan began to see that pain does not always arrive to punish us. Sometimes it exposes the places where we have placed our identity in things that cannot sustain us. Success can disappear. Plans can fail. Other people's approval can fade. But a human soul was never meant to build its entire worth on such fragile foundations. As this understanding slowly grew, Ethan felt no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden victory. Yet something subtle was changing. For the first time in a long while, he stopped asking only, "Why is this happening to me?" and began asking a different question. What might this season be teaching me that I could learn no other way? As Ethan sat with that new question, something inside him began to soften. His circumstances had not changed, and many of his questions remained unanswered. Yet he was starting to see that perhaps he had been looking at his life through a very narrow window. Like many people, he had measured the value of a season by how comfortable it felt, how successful it appeared, or how quickly it delivered the results he wanted. But what if life was larger than the chapter he was currently living? What if some moments could only be understood from a distance? Think about how often we look back on difficult seasons and realize they were shaping us in ways we could never have recognized at the time. The path that once seemed confusing later reveals a hidden pattern. The delay that felt unfair teaches patience. The disappointment that broke our expectations opens a door to deeper wisdom. Ethan began to wonder if the same might be true for him. Perhaps meaning was not always visible in the moment. Perhaps some truths need time before they can be fully seen. As these thoughts settled into his heart, he remembered how many stories in Scripture involved people walking through long periods of uncertainty before understanding the purpose behind them. They were not given a complete map of the future. They were given only enough light for the next step. There is something deeply human about wanting the entire picture before we move forward. Yet there is also something beautiful about learning to trust that today's unfinished story is not the final story. Ethan realized that much of his suffering came from demanding answers that time itself had not yet revealed. This realization did not erase his pain, but it changed his relationship with it. Instead of seeing himself as trapped in a meaningless struggle, he began to consider another possibility. Maybe he was still in the middle of a process whose purpose had not fully unfolded. Maybe what felt like a detour was quietly becoming part of a larger journey. And for the first time in a very long while, that thought brought a gentle sense of peace. Something subtle began to change within Ethan, and at first, he almost missed it. His circumstances looked much the same as before. The challenges had not disappeared. The future was still uncertain. Yet the constant pressure inside his heart was no longer controlling every thought. He found himself pausing more often, breathing more deeply, and reacting less harshly to the fears that once dominated him. The problems were still present, but they no longer seemed powerful enough to define his entire life. Perhaps one of the greatest forms of freedom is not the absence of difficulty, but the discovery that difficulty does not have to own us. Ethan began to see himself with more compassion. For years, he had judged himself by his failures, measuring his worth against expectations he could never fully satisfy. Now he started asking a gentler question. What if I have been carrying burdens that no human being was meant to carry alone? That thought opened a door inside him. Slowly, he began releasing some of the blame he had placed on himself. He stopped treating every setback as proof of personal inadequacy. There is a quiet kind of courage in showing yourself the same kindness you would offer a hurting friend. As this shift continued, Ethan also noticed changes in how he viewed other people. The disappointments that once hardened his heart began losing their grip. He became more aware that everyone carries invisible struggles. Everyone fights battles that cannot be seen from the outside. This realization softened his judgments and deepened his compassion. One of life's most beautiful paradoxes is that our wounds, when healed properly, often become the source of our greatest empathy. Ethan was not becoming a different person. He was becoming more fully himself. The fear that once demanded constant attention was giving way to something quieter and stronger. Not certainty, not perfection, but peace. A peace rooted not in having all the answers, but in accepting that his value, his purpose, and his future were larger than any single season of struggle. And for the first time in many months, his heart felt lighter than his circumstances. Hope did not return to Ethan's life as a grand miracle or a dramatic breakthrough. It arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first. One afternoon, while walking through a nearby park, he found himself paying attention to things he had ignored for months. The warmth of sunlight through the trees, the laughter of strangers, the gentle rhythm of life continuing around him. For a moment, he felt present instead of trapped inside his worries. It was a small moment, but something inside him shifted. Have you ever noticed how healing often begins with the smallest signs, long before circumstances begin to change? Ethan realized that while he had spent months searching for reasons to believe the future could be good, he had overlooked the gifts that still existed in the present. Not because his struggles were unimportant, but because pain has a way of narrowing our vision until we can see only what is missing. Yet life contains more than our losses. Even in difficult seasons, there are moments of beauty quietly waiting to be noticed. This realization filled him with an unexpected sense of gratitude. Nothing external had been fixed. The questions remained. The challenges remained. But gratitude was creating space for something new. One of life's hidden paradoxes is that hope often grows not from certainty about tomorrow, but from appreciation for what still exists today. As Ethan reflected on his journey, he began to see evidence of strength he had not recognized before. He had survived days he once thought would break him. He had continued moving forward even when he felt lost. Perhaps resilience is not the absence of struggle, but the decision to keep walking through it. That thought brought tears to his eyes. Not tears of sadness, but of relief. For the first time in a very long while, the future no longer felt like a dark wall. It felt like an unopened door. And although he could not yet see what was on the other side, he found himself believing that something good might still be waiting there. As Ethan looked back on the months that had changed him, he began to understand something he could not have understood at the beginning of his journey. The greatest gift of this season was not the removal of hardship. It was the transformation of the person walking through it. For so long, he had believed that peace would come after life became easier. He thought confidence would return once all his questions were answered. He thought happiness depended on circumstances finally going his way. But experience had taught him something very different. What if peace is not found at the end of the struggle, but discovered within it? That question stayed with him because it explained so much of what he had been learning. Ethan realized that he had spent years trying to control outcomes that were never fully within his control. When life refused to follow his plans, fear took over. Yet the more he released the need to control everything, the lighter his heart became. This was not giving up. It was learning the difference between carrying responsibility and carrying burdens that were never his to bear. There is a quiet wisdom in knowing what to hold tightly and what to place down. He also saw that suffering had revealed strengths he never knew he possessed. Patience, compassion, humility, resilience. These qualities had not appeared despite the difficult season. They had grown because of it. Many of the most valuable parts of a person are formed in places they would never willingly choose. Looking back, Ethan understood a profound truth. The seasons that seem to be taking something from us are sometimes giving us something far more valuable in return. This realization did not make the past easy, but it made it meaningful. And perhaps that is one of the most healing discoveries a person can make. When pain finds purpose, it loses some of its power to define us. As Ethan's heart absorbed this truth, he no longer saw himself as someone who had been broken by life. He saw himself as someone who had been shaped by it, and that changed everything. One quiet evening, Ethan sat by the window and noticed something that would have seemed impossible months earlier. The constant tension that had lived in his chest was no longer there. Not completely gone, but softer, gentler, no longer demanding all of his attention. For so long, he had carried invisible weights everywhere he went. Regret for the past, fear of the future, disappointment in himself. He had treated these burdens as if they were part of his identity. But now he began to see them differently. A burden carried for a long time can start to feel like a permanent part of who we are. But what if some of the things we carry were never meant to stay with us forever? Ethan thought about the mistakes he had replayed countless times in his mind, the conversations he wished he could change, the opportunities he thought he had wasted. For years, he believed that holding on to these regrets would somehow protect him from repeating them. Yet all they had truly done was keep old wounds from healing. Slowly, he began offering himself something he had freely given others but rarely gave himself: grace. Not because he was perfect, not because the past did not matter, but because no human heart can heal while constantly standing trial before its own judgment. As this understanding deepened, another form of healing followed. Ethan found himself releasing resentment toward people who had hurt him, not excusing their actions, and not pretending the pain never happened. Simply choosing not to let those wounds continue controlling his future. There is a quiet freedom in realizing that forgiveness is often less about the other person and more about reclaiming peace within yourself. As the evening light faded, Ethan felt an unfamiliar calm settle over him. His life was still imperfect. Some questions remained unanswered, yet his soul no longer felt at war with itself. And perhaps that is one of the most beautiful forms of healing. Not when everything around us changes, but when we finally stop fighting ourselves and begin meeting our own hearts with compassion, understanding, and peace. As Ethan reflected on everything he had learned, he realized that the most meaningful lessons were not reserved for extraordinary moments. They belonged to ordinary days, the kind of days most of us live. The journey had taught him that life is rarely changed by one dramatic breakthrough. More often, it is shaped by small choices repeated with patience, courage, and kindness. Perhaps that is encouraging to remember. You do not need to have every answer before taking the next step. You only need enough light to move forward today. In his relationships, Ethan became more careful with the assumptions he made about other people. His own struggles had shown him how much pain can remain invisible. The coworker who seems distant may be carrying grief. The friend who withdraws may be fighting a battle they cannot explain. The family member who appears strong may be quietly exhausted. One of the most human lessons we can learn is that compassion becomes easier when we remember that everyone is carrying something. At work, Ethan stopped measuring his worth solely by results and achievements. He still worked hard, but he no longer allowed success or failure to determine his value as a person. This brought a surprising sense of freedom. When our identity depends entirely on outcomes, every setback feels personal. But when our worth is rooted more deeply, challenges become teachers rather than judges. In his personal growth, Ethan learned to treat himself with the same patience he offered others. Progress did not need to be perfect to be meaningful. Healing did not need to happen quickly to be real. There is wisdom in understanding that growth often looks less like a straight line and more like a winding path. Looking back, Ethan saw that the greatest change was not that life had become easier. It was that he had become stronger, gentler, and more grounded within himself. And perhaps that is a lesson worth carrying into every season. When we meet life with courage, compassion, and hope, even difficult chapters can help us become the kind of person we were meant to be. One morning, Ethan stepped outside and paused for a moment beneath the soft light of a new day. The world around him looked much the same as it always had. The streets were familiar. The challenges waiting ahead had not magically disappeared. Yet something was different. The heaviness that once followed him everywhere no longer felt like the center of his story. For the first time in a long while, he felt present, not trapped in yesterday's regrets, not lost in tomorrow's worries, simply present. And sometimes that is where healing quietly reveals itself, not in extraordinary moments, but in the ability to fully return to the life that is already in front of us. Ethan smiled as he reflected on the journey behind him. The path had not been easy. There had been nights filled with questions, seasons marked by uncertainty, and moments when hope felt impossibly far away. Yet every step, even the painful ones, had shaped something beautiful within him. He had discovered strength without becoming hard. He had found peace without having all the answers. He had learned that a gentle heart can still be a courageous one. Perhaps that is true for all of us. The chapters that challenge us are often the same chapters that teach us how resilient, compassionate, and capable of healing we truly are. As the morning breeze moved through the trees, Ethan felt a quiet gratitude for how far he had come. Not because his life was perfect, but because he no longer needed perfection to feel hopeful. There would still be difficult days ahead. There would still be questions waiting to unfold. But now he understood something that changed everything. A difficult season is not the whole story, and a wounded heart is not a finished heart. If you have been carrying burdens for a long time, if you have felt tired, uncertain, or alone, perhaps this gentle truth is meant for you. Your story is still being written. There is still goodness ahead. There is still light beyond what you can currently see. And no matter how long the road has felt, you do not have to walk the next part of it with fear. You can walk it with hope.